Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Revelation class. It is Revelation class number 20. Hard to believe we've been at this since the first week of September already. And we are today going to be talking about Revelation chapter 6, verses 3 through 8, and I'll read those for you as we go along. And this is about the four horses of the apocalypse: the white horse, the red horse, the black horse, and the pale horse. And we're going to see that pale is really not the correct translation of the word chloros in Greek, which is the word that's actually used by John. But we're going to go through those this morning and take a look at them. We looked at the white horse last week, and we're going to look at the other horses today. Let me start by reading you verses 3 through 4 of Revelation, and this is about the red horse. And it's about war, and it's about bloodshed. When the Lamb opened the second seal, that would be John, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. The rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make men slay each other. To him was given a large sword. So obviously war is happening here. Before we dive into this horse, let's talk about the horsemen for a second. Most people talk about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And that's not exactly accurate. There really aren't four horsemen. There are four horses. There is one man on each of the four horses, and he is the same man, and he is the Antichrist. There are not four Antichrists in the book of Revelation. There is only one, and the Bible's clear on that all the way through. So when people talk about the four horsemen of the apocalypse, they really don't quite have that correct. What is really correct is there are four horses of the apocalypse with the same guy coming out riding them each time. So what's happening up in heaven is Jesus is opening this scroll, and as he's opening this scroll, he's breaking seals on it to open the scroll. And the scroll was a land scroll that's going to give the Antichrist the ability to rule this earth for a period of time. And it's a scroll that Jesus himself owns because he is the owner of the earth. But as he goes through each of these seals, the Antichrist will ride into the world with some new things that Jesus is empowering him with. That's what's happening with these four seals as Jesus is opening them. So remember last week, he opened the first seal, and the first seal, out came the Antichrist riding on a white horse. And a white horse symbolizes a savior, right? Somebody who's going to save us, like the Lone Ranger who rides into town and saves us from the bad guys, or Hopalong Cassidy, or somebody like that, who rides into town on his white horse and saves us from the bad guys. Or for Americans, George Washington rode a white horse. He saved us from the British, right? A savior, somebody who's going to do good stuff and help people and save people. So he's going to pretend to be that. He's going to come into town or into the world pretending to help people, pretending to save them. But in reality, he's carrying a bow in his hand. And the interesting piece is he's not carrying arrows. He's only carrying a bow. And that means he's going to, it also says he's bent on conquest. He's a conqueror and he's bent on conquest. So his real agenda is not to bring peace and kumbaya to the world, which is how he's presenting himself. His real agenda is to conquer in the world. And he brings into town a bow that he's carrying, but no arrows. So at this point, all Jesus has released him to do is to threaten people, right? To pretend he's getting ready to invade them, pretend he's getting ready to make war. And that's what he's got the power to do with the first horse. But with the second horse, Jesus now opens the second seal. And when he opens the second seal, the Antichrist is now riding a red horse on earth. And the red horse means that, as it says here, he has the power to take peace from the earth. He has the power to make war. He has the power to bring bloodshed. So now Jesus is giving him the power to actually make war. And he will do that. That is what he wants to do. And he will probably do that initially through a miscalculation. We talked about that last week. There have been so many situations in history where people miscalculate and think that they can get away with threatening war. Eventually somebody stands up to them. It's like the bully in the schoolyard. Those of us that have had to deal with bullies in the schoolyard know that all you got to do is punch him in the nose and he usually goes away. That's not exactly how most parents train their children, but that's probably how it really works. But this is the bully in the schoolyard. Eventually he's going to miscalculate, and when he does, it could start a war. It probably will. Now, The reason we know this is the same person on all four of these horses is that Revelation uses the term he each time. He is the same pronoun. I mean, if there were four different people, it couldn't use the same pronoun in each of these four passages. So it uses the same pronoun, he, and it describes him as, in the first one, the white horse, it describes him as the rider. So he is the rider and he is he. So we know that. Now, and that happens, let's see. Yeah, it happens 4 times in each of the 4. If we go back to Daniel 9:27, which we covered a couple of weeks ago, we see a very similar thing there. Daniel talks about this person as being the ruler who is to come. That is the Antichrist, right? The ruler who is to come. And then Daniel in 9:27 goes on 3 times to use the pronoun he to describe him. So Daniel also describes him as he, way back in Daniel 9:27. So this is the same person, just coming in 4 different ways on 4 different horses into the world. What's actually different about the horses is the color. And the color has to do with what they're bringing into the world. We talked about white just a minute ago. We talked about red being the color of blood, the color of war. And as he comes in on the red horse, he now has the power to bring war to the world. And he will miscalculate, and he will do that. He will bring war to the world. So each one of these, as Jesus releases them, bring great havoc onto the earth. Now, can anybody think of another time in Scripture where we see 4 horses in the scene? It actually occurs one other time in Scripture. It occurs back in the book of Zechariah, in the opening chapter of the book of Zechariah, in verses 8, 10, and 11. Jesus is in the presence of 4 horses. And it's a little bit different from this. The colors are slightly different. But bear in mind, Zechariah was written hundreds of years before John wrote this. But it's pretty clear that we're talking about the same horses here as you kind of see this. But the scene, let me read this to you, first of all, from Zechariah, chapter 1, verses 8, 10, and 11. During the night, that's Zechariah, during the night I had a vision, and there before me was a man riding a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees. We're going to talk about the myrtle trees in a minute, in a ravine. Behind him were red, brown, and white horses. So that's 4 horses all total, right? Then the man standing among the myrtle trees explained, "They are the ones the Lord has sent to go out throughout the earth." And they reported, that they would be the horses, reported to the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord is a name that Zechariah and many Old Testament writers used for Jesus. So it's a pre-incarnate form of Jesus. So let me repeat that again. And they reported to the angel of the Lord. So the horses are following the direction of the angel of the Lord, of Jesus, who was standing among the myrtle trees. And what they say is, "We have gone throughout the earth and found the whole world at rest and in peace." So the scene here is actually at a different point we'll get to later in Revelation. And that's the point where where all this is now over at the end of Revelation. All the killing is over, all the death is over, all the war is over, and Jesus has come back and he has established his millennial kingdom here on earth. And this is the period of the millennial kingdom that's being discussed here in Zechariah. And it's a period where everything is at peace, and the horses are saying, "Hey, we're not out there creating all this havoc anymore. Everything's fine. We're just here grazing among the myrtle trees," right? And Jesus is controlling us, and he's got this under control. So it's the same 4 horses, but they're occurring in a different context, the context being the end of the tribulation, beyond the end of the tribulation, rather than at the beginning of the tribulation. So it's interesting that John uses 4 horses, same as Zechariah did. The colors are ever so slightly different. But then again, Hebrew translates, Zechariah was written in Hebrew. The Apocalypse, Revelation is written in Greek. So Hebrew translates words a little differently than Greek does. Anyway, moving on to your second page of your notes here. So the second horse rides in, carrying the Antichrist. And this horse is fiery red. Fiery red, as we said, is the color of blood. And that's the intent of this, is to let us think of blood. We talked about the first horse earlier, him coming in on the white horse as a savior and trying to figure out how to manipulate people without starting a war, because he doesn't have arrows, he just has a bow. But now, when he gets the second horse, now he can go ahead and manipulate people and threaten war and really deliver on that. He can really deliver war, and he's about to do that, and he's going to do that. Remember, he's going to start out with a false peace. He's going to start out by brokering a deal with Israel, and that's how he's going to get his white horse fame, is he'll come in as a peacemaker, a person who can be a peacemaker. It's a fraud. He's really coming in to conquer and to make war, but he will come in as a fraud, convincing people to make peace. And the way our media is today, they'll probably accept that, right? They'll probably say, "Yep, he's a peaceful guy. We ought to just, we ought to just go along with this Antichrist guy." If you think about a peace, and the peace deal we know will be with Israel. Daniel told us that way back in Daniel 9:25, 6, and 7. He told us that he would come into power, the Antichrist would come into power by putting together a peace deal with Israel. So if you think about what Israel wants, we've been to Israel a few times, we know pretty well what they want over there. What they want is they want peace. First of all, they're tired of constantly having to fight wars against all their neighbors and against the Palestinians around them. They want security. They want to know that Israel's going to continue to exist and people aren't going to try to wipe it out every few years. And they want to rebuild the temple on Temple Mount so that they can worship God again up on Temple Mount. So those are the three things they want. And if the Antichrist can deliver those three things, he can probably get Israel to sign off on this deal. Even though he may be doing it fraudulently, he can probably get Israel to sign off on it. So what do the Palestinians want? What the Palestinians want is a state of their own. And the reason they want a state of their own is that gives them UN recognition. Now they can, now they can get weapons. They can, they can have an army. They can have all this stuff so they can be ready to destroy Israel. So they want a state of their own. That's the two-state solution. And Israel wants peace, security, and to rebuild the Temple Mount. So what might this deal look like? I don't know exactly, but maybe the Antichrist comes in and says, "Tell you what, Israel, we'll give you the three things you want. We're going to give you peace. We will guarantee your safety against the Palestinians and all these other people. And we'll give you the right to rebuild your temple on Temple Mount. But in return, you have to cut the land in half and give half of the land part of the land to the Palestinians." It says back in Joel chapter 2, verse 1, that that's exactly what will happen, that the Antichrist will cut the land in half as part of this deal, and half of it will go to Israel's enemies. So that's probably the peace deal that's coming. And when you see somebody who is working on putting that peace deal together, you might know that the Antichrist is about to be revealed, because he'll be the one who will put that deal together. So we don't know exactly who that person will be. Anyway, so the Antichrist puts this peace deal together, threatens people. Threatening people works for a while. If you think about Hitler back in the 1930s, he sent his troops into the Rhineland. The French pulled out. The French troops were there, they pulled out. He sent his troops into the Saarland. The British pulled out. Nobody ever fired a shot. He sent his troops into Austria. Austria surrendered and said, "Yes, we're going to be one of your countries." Then he came to the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, and they said, "No, we don't think so. We think we're going to fight for our land." So he got the British Prime Minister and the French Prime Minister to get together with him, and they put together a deal that the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, called Peace in Our Time. And Peace in Our Time meant that Hitler got the Sudetenland, and he promised he would never ask for anything else again. Well, about a month later, he took the rest of Czechoslovakia, and within a few months after that, he was after other countries in Europe. And ultimately, he was able to peacefully win over a whole lot of places. Hungary went to him peacefully. Parts of Romania and Bulgaria went to him peacefully. But eventually, he threatened Poland, and when that didn't work, he finally had to pull out the red thing of war, the red sword of war, and go in, and he started World War II. He miscalculated. He didn't really think the other nations of Europe would support Poland, and he thought he had a good treaty with Russia to invade on the other side of Poland. So he didn't expect it would lead to World War II, but it did. Probably a similar thing coming here. The Antichrist will probably try to figure out how to manipulate people. But after a point, if he keeps threatening people militarily, eventually he's going to use that power, and when he does, it'll be war. So that's what's coming at some point. That is the second piece, the red horse of war. We're not talking about a minor war here. The Bible, I'm going to go into next week with you a discussion about what Jesus says in the Olivet Discourse about this war. But this war is probably going to be World War III before it gets over. And Jesus talks about a war where nation rises against nation and kingdom against kingdom until all the world is at war. That's the phrase that's used in there. And that comes out of Mark, I believe, the Mark version of the Olivet Discourse. We'll talk about that next week. But we're not talking about a small war here of Ukraine versus Russia. We're talking about a major world war coming out of this thing, presumably at some point. Let's talk about world wars for a minute, because world wars were really different. We didn't, up until the beginning of the 20th century, we never had a war where the entire world got involved and massive numbers of people died. Wars were typically fought by armies, just going, running into each other in a battle and fighting, and one army wins, the other army loses. But in World War I, all of a sudden civilian populations were getting killed by war. In World War I, the big thing was artillery. It was new in those days. They had cannons before that, but not the kind of artillery they had in World War I. And this artillery could fire shells 20 miles. And people were getting killed, civilians were getting killed, civilians were being pushed out of the way and dying of famine and everything else. Anyway, it's estimated that in World War I, 15 to 22 million people died, depending on whose estimates you read. That is way beyond any previous war in history. And by the way, 88% of the world's countries were involved in World War II. They made declarations of war at World War I, I'm sorry. And everybody thought it was the war to end all wars. That was what it was called. They thought there could never, ever be another war like this one again. And we're going to talk about birth pangs next week, how birth pangs start fairly gentle, and then they get stronger and stronger and worse, and then they come closer and closer together. We're going to talk about what Jesus said about birth pangs next week. But that's very similar to what's happening with these world wars. The second one actually came pretty quickly. Within 20-some years, 21 years later, we were into World War II. I talked about Hitler starting World War II. In World War II, 95% of the nations of the world were involved in that. Almost everybody. And depending on whose estimate you read, between 69 and 84 million people died. Incredible numbers of people died in World War II, most of them civilians. These were not mostly military people. So the death toll gets higher with each war. We can assume the next one is probably going to be, the next world war is probably going to be nuclear. In order to go to numbers much greater than that, we're probably looking at a nuclear war. We're going to look at what Zechariah says about nuclear war next week as well, in Zechariah 14. Today in World War II, there were only 2 nuclear weapons ever used, and those were used right at the end of the war. Today, there are tens of thousands of much more powerful nuclear weapons that are in the possession of all kinds of bad actors. I mean, the United States has its share, and Britain and France have their share, and they're not necessarily bad actors, but the Russians have huge numbers. The Chinese are building immense numbers. Iran has nuclear weapons. North Korea has nuclear weapons, and now very soon Iran will have them. Our president is negotiating a deal with Iran that will allow them to have nuclear weapons. It says it's going to stop them, but in reality it allows them to have it at a certain date, a couple of years in the future. So it basically says for a couple of years they can't have them, but then they're perfectly allowed to be a nuclear power. So nuclear weapons are coming, they're spreading around the world, and they're more powerful, and there's tens of thousands of them out there. It's inconceivable that they won't be used again at some point. I think we're living in a bubble if we think we aren't going to see a nuclear war at some point in the future. So moving on to the third page. So one other thing I wanted to say, in there, John is told by the angel to come. You'll see the word come is in each of these 4 things, and it's in a few other places in Revelation. Come is a Greek word. We translate it as come in my translation here, but it actually means look away, look to a different place than where you're looking. So if you're looking over here, come means look to a different place. And in John's case, what he's being told is to look down at what's happening on the earth. Remember, he's up in heaven. He's looking at the angels at the throne room of God. Now he's being told, come. That means to look down at what's happening on the earth, and that is these horses riding out onto the earth, the 4 horses. So when you see the word come, that's what it means here in Revelation. Let's move on. Questions on the red horse? Let's move on.
Excuse me. Remind me again, what was the white horse doing? What did it mean?
The white horse is designed to look, it's a fraud. It's designed to look like he's the good guy, like the Lone Ranger, riding into town to help people. The savior, right? The person who comes in and saves people that are in trouble. So it's a fraud. It's designed to look like a savior, but in reality, he's coming into town with a bow. He's coming into town bent on conquest, and at that point, he doesn't really have the arrows yet to back that bow up, but he'll get that when the red horse comes. With the red horse, he has a sword. So, and it's a bloody sword he'll have with him. So let's move on to the black horse. This is now Revelation 6, verses 5 through 6. This is the 3rd horse of the apocalypse. When the Lamb opened the 3rd seal, the Lamb would be Jesus, I, that would be John, heard the 3rd living creature say, come. Here's come again, right? I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a day's wages, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and wine. So, at first, this can be kind of confusing. What is he talking about here, right? It's a black horse. And the black horse here, so it's this horse here, the black horse. And let's just kind of go through this. First of all, the word come is in there. And that means that the angel wants John to look down and see this next horse coming onto the earth. And this next horse is black. This next horse is what follows a war. If you think about a war, especially a nuclear war, all this fallout coming down, agriculture is going to be pretty much destroyed by that. It's going to be hard to have food. You know, cows will be eating grass that's contaminated. The cows will give milk that's contaminated, have meat that's contaminated, and so on. Food is going to all of a sudden get into very short supply. Almost every war in history has famine associated with it. And that's caused by the conquering army comes in and they take what they want, right? They just take whatever they want from the land, and whatever they don't want, they just leave. But there's not enough for the civilian population at that point, because the army, they always say the army marches on its stomach, right? The army needs the food, so the army will take what it wants. So, and another thing that happens, and this happened in particular in World War I. In World War I, everybody assumed that this would all be over in 90 days. You know, we're going to win, we'll win in 90 days. Everybody thought that, right? All of them thought that. They all thought they were going to win. Obviously, none of them won. They all lost, basically. But what they did in World War I was they drafted farmers. Not a smart move. And they drafted farmers in the summer, so they weren't there for the fall. When the fall harvest came up, there were no farmers, because, not no farmers, but very few farmers, because the farmers were in the military. And they just assumed the war would be over by then and they could send the farmers back out, but the war wasn't over. So that was another problem they had. So famines are something that follow war. After World War I, the thing, by the way, that made Herbert Hoover famous and eventually turned him into our president was that Herbert Hoover led the relief effort after World War I of bringing food from the United States over to Europe. Europe was in such a huge famine after World War I that Herbert Hoover organized this huge relief effort with ships and ships and ships of grain going over to Europe to feed the people over there until they could get their agriculture rolling again and get it going again. So famine always follows a war. And famine obviously can lead to starvation. And so that's what's being talked about here. It says the rider has a pair of scales in his hand, and that's an interesting point. Now, in our culture today, we think of scales, at least I think of scales, I think of the Supreme Court in Washington and the picture of the blind person up there holding the scales of justice, the idea being that justice is blind and the judge will balance off everything and decide what's right. So it's about fairness and rightness and justice. That's how we think of scales today, but that's not at all the way scales were thought of back in the time of John. In the time of John, scales were commercial, and they were all about what you see in your grocery store today with scales, right? They were all about weighing things to make sure that you're getting your money's worth of whatever it is you're buying. So if you're buying carrots at $1 a pound or whatever they are, you put the carrots in over here, you look at the scale, and it tells you how many dollars it is for the carrots that you're buying. That's the use of scales that John is talking about here. He's talking about commerce. He's talking about the ability to for people to be able to trust each other in a commercial transaction. And what he's saying is a quart of wheat for a day's wages and 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages. That doesn't sound like anything we understand. But that would have made a whole lot of sense in the Roman Empire days. The Romans had a coin that was called the denarius. And the denarius had 5 grams of silver in it. And a day laborer was paid 1 denarius for 1 day of labor. So if you were a manual laborer putting bricks up or carpentry work or whatever it was, you typically were paid 1 denarius for 1 day's labor. And at the end of the day, you got your denarius, your silver coin. And the Roman coinage was pretty stable over that period of time, in the time of Jesus and the time of John. So 1 denarius at that time bought, let me find it again here, fourth page, all right? Yeah. 1 denarius in John's day bought 12 quarts of wheat and 36 quarts of barley. Most people cared about bread. That's what most people ate. Wheat was the preferred way, and it made better bread and more bread, but barley was the kind of the poor man's way to make bread in those days. So 1 denarius, 1 day's wages, this one little silver coin that people were paid in the Roman Empire in those days, would buy 12 quarts of wheat or 36 quarts of barley. Now, that's not what it says here, though. It says here, let me find it again. It says here that a quart of wheat for a day's wages. So that's actually an inflation of 12 times, right? In other words, instead of a day's wages buying 12 quarts of wheat, a day's wages are only going to buy 1 quart of wheat. We call that inflation, right? Anybody see any inflation going on in the world today? But inflation always follows a war as well. And the reason is the government, in order to pay for the army and pay for the war and pay for the soldiers and all the bombs that they're blowing up and the planes and everything else, the government has to borrow money. And when they borrow money, they have to print money they also have to print money in order to pay for things. And as they print money, all of a sudden there's more money out there in circulation, and meanwhile there's fewer things because the army is using more stuff. So prices go up. So mostly we've seen inflation in history in times of war and after war. The losing nation in a war really gets horrendous inflation because now their currency is worth nothing, and because their country has lost the war. So inflation happens in wartime. And what John's talking about here is the economic chaos that follows a war. The economic chaos where the price of everything goes through the roof, nobody has the money to be able to afford things, people are in poverty and are impoverished by war. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about inflation. By the way, interestingly enough, as you think about the inflation that's going on today in the United States, historically, if you look at our inflations, we had an inflation during World War I and right after World War I for exactly the reason I just talked about. We had to spend a ton of money on arms and soldiers and salaries and all that, so the government printed the money. And we had a big inflation, but by the early 20s that was over. The war ended in 1918, so it lasted a few years. The second big inflation we had was after the World War II. And after World War II, again, similar thing, the government spent all this money for the war. At one point we had 16 million people in uniform in World War II. So the government was spending money to pay these people and pay for all of the bombs and everything else, guns. And the inflation came in 1945 as soon as the war ended. And then, luckily, that one ended pretty quickly because it turns out that all these people coming back decided to have more babies, decided to build more houses, And a lot of the factories that were being used to make planes and guns and bombs and jeeps and tanks and all that stuff were all started to be converted into making automobiles and refrigerators and washing machines and some of the kinds of things that people wanted, and people got involved in building homes. And so the inflation went away again within a couple of years. We had the third inflation was in 1950 at the start of the Korean War, same thing. It went away very quickly as the war started to wind down. And the fourth inflation we've had, and this one's in most of our lifetimes, was in the 1960s and 70s when the Vietnam War was going on. And our government started having to pay money for all the Vietnam War. At the same time, they started the Great Society, which was not a smart thing to do at the same time, because you have money going out for the Great Society programs and money going for this Vietnam War at the same time. And that inflation lasted all the way into the early 1980s. What makes the inflation we have today different is there's no war involved. We're not at war. We are not using this money to buy bombs and guns and pay soldiers. We're using this money to just distribute out to people today. And that's going to come back to bite us if, in fact, we ever get into an actual war. So the inflation could be even worse this time than it was last time, because it's already here, even though we don't have a war going on yet. So what he's talking about here is inflation and the kind of economic chaos that comes during a war and after a war when all the economic stuff is messed up. And as I said, if you're on the losing side of the war, your currency becomes worthless, and then your inflation is essentially 1,000%, right? You know, you can take a wheelbarrow full of money and go try to buy a loaf of bread, and you might not be able to with that. Let's talk about scales. And scales, we use scales in commerce. Back in those days, we used scales in commerce. Today, we have a lot of other things we use in commerce. But we used scales primarily back in commerce in those days, because that was a way for people who didn't know each other to trust each other. They could come together and weigh out the amount of grain they were buying and the amount of money they were paying for it, and they could know they were getting the fair deal, the correct deal. God talks about this through Micah, back in Micah 6, verses 10 through 12. He talks about people who do commerce dishonestly, and that will go up, that will increase during the war as well. But what we see today in the world is a lot of people are doing commerce dishonestly. We see things going on with the people, some of our tech giants that are running the internet are all of a sudden shutting down other people and not allowing them to talk, or not allowing them on the internet, or not allowing them to put their thoughts out there on various ways. So we see that starting to happen today, that commerce is getting corrupted. But in Micah 6, I'm going to read this to you, verses 10 through 12. We just hear God's agony over this. This is God speaking to Micah now. Am I still to forget, O wicked house, your ill-gotten treasures and the short ephah? An ephah, by the way, was like a bushel basket in those days, so it was a way of measuring grain. And your short ephah, which is accursed. Shall I acquit a man with dishonest scales, with a bag of false weights? People sometimes said this is a kilogram, but it was really only a half a kilogram or something, so that they would give the person less grain or less whatever they were buying. Her rich men are violent, her people are liars, and their tongues speak deceitfully. So God was saying that the rich will frequently use corrupt practices to essentially take money from the poor. We've seen that throughout all of history. Micah in particular was onto that theme back here in Micah chapter 6, that the rich were using their power in commerce to take money from the poor and make themselves richer. For many rich people, there's never enough. You know, they need just a little bit more, and then they need more still. And God hates. It's clear from what God is saying here that God hates this. He hates when people steal from other people. He hates to see that. He really hates that. And you can tell. He says, am I to forget, O wicked house, your ill-gotten treasures and the short ephah, which is accursed? I think that says it all right there, right? God hates seeing this. He hates seeing people stealing from other people. So again, we see the pronoun he is used here for the rider of the horse, and the pronoun he means that this is the Antichrist who's riding the horse, the same person that we saw way back in Daniel. and the same person that we saw riding the white horse and that we saw riding the red horse. Okay, now, two things are actually excluded from the inflation here. Interesting. If you read, let's go back and read this again. There's two things that are not going to be inflated here. Let's go back and look at that again. I'm going to go back and reread part of this. It says, a quart of wheat for a day's wages, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine. Now, lots been written on that over the years. What is John talking about here? What is God talking about to John here? I don't know the answer, but I'll tell you what I think is probably correct and what I see most as I investigate this with people that have really looked at this subject. Wine and oil are two key products that come out of Israel. Israel has oil that comes out of a number of different products that they make there, palms and palm oil and a number of other kinds of oil. Olive oil comes out of there. Wine is grown in Israel. It was grown in that time. It's still grown today in Israel in those times. Most of the people who look at this say that what it might mean is God might be giving us a signal here that this problem might be less in Israel than it is in other places of the world, i.e. God might be protecting Israel during this period. And I think as we go through Revelation, we're going to see Israel get spared from certain things that other people don't get spared from during the tribulation. So I hope we all make it out of here in the rapture. But if you don't, go move to Israel, because it's probably going to be a lot better there. It's going to be horrendous everywhere else. It'll be a little less than horrendous in Israel. So hopefully we're all gone. We're all in heaven with Jesus. But if not, move to Israel. It's probably going to be a little bit better there because the Jews are God's people, and the whole tribulation is about freeing the Jews from the times of the Gentiles. It's about freeing the Jews from oppression by the Gentiles. So God will be having more mercy on the Jewish people during this time than he will on other people. And we'll see that all through Revelation as we go, or all through the tribulation as we go through it in Revelation. So it's interesting that those two things are excluded from the inflation here. Okay, so now we've seen the Antichrist come to power by portraying himself as a man of peace, as a savior on the white horse. And brokering this Middle East peace that makes him a hero in the world, at least for a couple of days until it falls apart. And it will fall apart very quickly. And then he pushes his conquest. He deceives people about his intentions. And he gets more power, and he miscalculates, and next thing you know, he starts a war. Starts World War III, and by that point, he's got the means to do it. He's got the sword, and he's got the red horse, and he's got the means to be able to start World War III because Jesus has given him that. And now Jesus has given him the power to bring economic chaos to the world with the black horse. By opening that seal, Jesus is giving the Antichrist the power to bring economic chaos to the world. So that's what's happening next. So now we're going to head to the fourth seal and see the last thing that Jesus is going to give him here. Actually, there's two more things Jesus is going to give him, but the last horse that Jesus is going to give him. And this is going to be what they call the pale horse. I'm going to explain the word chloros in Greek here in a minute. So let me read that to you first. This is Revelation 6, verses 7 through 8. When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, the Lamb would be Jesus, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, come. So he wants John to look down at the earth again. I looked, he looks down at the earth, and there before me was a pale horse. The actual Greek word is for pale is chloros. I'm going to come to that later. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. So again, its rider is the Antichrist, but its rider is named Death. We're going to see why in a minute. They were given the power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. So now Jesus, by opening this fourth seal, is giving the Antichrist the power to bring death to the earth on a massive scale. He can bring death to up to a quarter of the people of the earth. It doesn't say he's going to kill a quarter of the people of the earth. It says he's going to give him the power to kill that many people of the earth. He may not kill that many, but that is a lot of people. Now let me throw some numbers up here for you. Right now on Earth, there are 7.6 billion people. If you look at the rapture, I don't know what the rapture is going to take off the earth. A lot of believing Christians, some children, babies, whatever. Let's just say, just to pick a nice round number that I can turn into a round number here, let's just say it's 1.6 billion disappear in the rapture. I have no idea what that number is going to be. I'm just throwing a number out so we can play with some numbers here. What that leaves is 6 billion people on Earth. 1/4 of that is 1.5 billion people. That's as many people as are in China, right? As many people as are in India. That is a lot of people. So the Antichrist is going to have the power from Christ to bring death to 1.5 billion people as a result of all of this. That's what is being said here. Jesus is giving him the power to kill 1.5 billion people on earth. And we're still in the first half of the tribulation. It's going to get a whole lot worse in the second half. So he's going to have the power to kill up to 1.5 billion people. That's why he's called death, right? That's why the Antichrist in this place is called death. Now, the actual Greek word that we translate as pale horse, is chloros. And chloros has a slightly different meaning that doesn't translate well into English. Chloros is the color of a decaying body in Greek. We don't really have a name for that in English. So we just call it pale because the body looks pale. But it's the color, it's kind of a grayish, greenish color of a body that has decayed over a period of time. Frankly, personally, I've never seen a body that's decayed for a few weeks, so I don't really know what it looks like. But supposedly, the color of that is chloros, which is a Greek word, and that is a grayish, greenish, palish kind of color. Now, obviously there aren't horses that have that color. So all of these horses, I mean, a fiery red horse, I've seen red horses, but they aren't fiery red. They don't look like a fire engine, right? Black horses I've seen tons of. I've seen white horses, but the pale horse is saying that this is a horse that looks like death. That's what the term pale horse means when you see it. Some translations, I looked at a couple translations of this. Some translations call it a gray horse. Some translations call it a dappled horse. Dappled is those of you that are horse people, a kind of gray. But at any rate, it's a horse that looks like death is what this means, what this word chloros means as you see it here. So he's going to bring death to the earth by sword. That's war. That's the red horse, right? He's got the power to bring death to the earth by sword. How are you going to kill 1.5 billion people by sword? How about nuclear war, right? Nuclear war would do it pretty quickly. You could kill a whole bunch of people in a whole hurry. The second thing it talks about is famine. If it's nuclear war and the fallout's coming down on the earth, you're going to destroy agriculture. If you destroy agriculture, people are going to die by eating crops that they shouldn't be eating, or people aren't going to be able to find food that they can eat safely. So we're looking at famine, death caused by famine. Famine on scales we have never seen on this earth could be seen here. Plague. Anybody see any plagues starting to show up in the world today? Anybody see any viruses that have maybe been around in the last couple of years? Again, going back to this concept of birth pangs. Birth pangs started out very small. We saw some plagues maybe 20 years ago. We saw SARS, we saw Ebola, we saw H1N1, we saw swine flu. We saw a number of things over about the last 20 years that have been relatively small, but they keep getting bigger and bigger and worse, and they keep happening quicker, kind of like labor pains. So now we're into, the latest one is COVID. And obviously COVID even keeps changing. Some of us, think we're done with COVID, and next thing you know, there's some new COVID coming around. So, things are starting to happen on that front as well. At the end of the war, it would be even worse because people aren't picking up trash anymore, and, things are rotting, bodies are rotting, whatever. So there's, at the end of, war, or water's being polluted by radiation or by bodies in it or whatever. So, we're looking at pestilence on an increasing scale after a war. And wild beasts is the other one he mentions here. I don't know that we have a huge problem with that today. Perhaps if you live in the Serengeti in Africa, you might have to worry about lions coming in and eating you. But who knows? Maybe our dogs, if they can't get enough to eat, will start to become not our friends or not as much of our friends as we like. Maybe our cats will start scratching us. At any rate, he's going to be given the power to bring death to a whole huge number of people on the earth. So, let's see, we talked about Chloros. Moving on to the 5th page here. So these 4 horses are symbolic. Obviously, there isn't really a horse that has this particular color of Chloros, the color of a dead body, and nor is there a fiery red horse. So these horses are symbolic. But I don't doubt that John's looking and seeing horses that look like that in his vision. They just, he's looking at them, he's recording, or he's telling us what he sees. He sees a horse that looks like a dead body walking around down there with this person on it. I believe that he actually is seeing that. So there's widespread death going on the earth. Maybe as much as 1.5 billion people during this period. We'll see later on that another third of the earth's population is going to die later on. So this is there's huge numbers of people dying during this tribulation period. Now, let's talk about how people are going to look at this at the time. First of all, the rapture occurs, right? And all of a sudden, a huge percentage of the earth's population, whatever it is, it might be just a couple 100 million, it might be, maybe it's 1.6 billion, I don't know what it's going to be, but a huge number of people are all of a sudden gone from the earth. I can't wait to see how our media spins that. They will spin it in some way, manner, shape, or form. They'll probably blame it on global warming and say, the environment's being poisoned by something and that's causing these people to just vanish. And I don't know how they're going to do it, but our media will find some way to say that this really isn't happening and it's really not a big deal. And yet, huge numbers of people will disappear. Children will disappear. People that are Christians will disappear, and it's going to be known. And people will pretty much begin to realize, hey, there's something supernatural going on here. This is not natural for this to happen. This is not a natural occurrence. Even though the press may be spinning it as a natural occurrence, they may say there's electrical energy going on up there in the earth that comes from the sun that's causing these people to vanish, or whatever they use as an excuse to explain this, and they'll use something. They're not going to get away with it very long. And these first 4 can look kind of natural, right? We had a guy come out here on earth, it looked like a peacemaker, it turns out it really wasn't peace, he was lying, he was deceiving us. He started a war, but people start wars. Hitler started a war, Napoleon started a war, it happens, right? When you have war, you have economic chaos, that happens, right? That's part of war. And then you have death, that's part of war too, and you have all this other stuff, famine, and you have pestilence all going on. So all this stuff can be happening. Some of that will look fairly natural. But when we get to the next phase, we're going to find out that the supernatural begins happening. As we get a little bit further into chapter 6, we're going to start seeing God making it more and more and more obvious that God is behind this. And people on earth who might be sitting there saying, I don't really think there is a God, will begin to know very clearly that there really is a God. So we're going to start to see that as we get a little deeper into chapter 6. Next week, I'm actually going to take us on a little bit of a detour from Revelation. We're going to finish up Revelation the week after that, or Revelation 6 the week after that. But we're getting to the point where we need to talk about the Olivet Discourse. And this is what Jesus said on the Mount of Olives, and it's recorded on 3 of the 4 Gospels. It's recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's recorded in Matthew 24, in Luke 21, Mark 13, I think. But it's recorded in all 3 of them. And it happened a couple of days before Jesus went to the cross. And Jesus made what I call the great prophecy. And the great prophecy is he's telling what the signs of the coming tribulation period will be. And the experts call it the Olivet Discourse, so I'll use that term because that's what the experts call it. So we'll call it the Olivet Discourse because it happened on the Mount of Olives. But it is the greatest prophecy in the Bible, and it's where Jesus talks about the tribulation. And before we get too much deeper into the tribulation, I want to put in perspective for you what Jesus has to say, because he talks about birth pangs and a whole bunch of other things. And I want to make sure you really understand where he was trying to lead us to with that conversation. So next week we're going to take a 1-week detour into the Olivet Discourse and listen to what Jesus had to say about the tribulation before we come back the following week to continue on in Revelation. So, questions? So thank you, and for those of you at home, thank you for joining us. And if you are looking for the notes on the class, you can get them, you can download them. In the upper right of your screen, click on the word See More, and then you'll see a blue link come up. Click on that blue link and you'll get the class notes, and you can download them and print them and whatever you'd like to do at that point. And thank you again for joining us, everyone, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next week.